the north of the wind, the southern Adirondacks in upstate New York. This is our property here, and it's interesting, the history of the property, and not really knowing as you walk up through what really happened here 200, 300 years ago. And it's hard to understand what the trees and the ground looks like without really understanding what to look for. This particular forest here that we own is in the southern Adirondacks and just a couple hundred feet away from 109,000 acres of forever wild wilderness protected through the APA back in 1892 when they first created the blue line surrounding the Adirondack Park. This property happens to be within that original blue line. If we start back at the beginning and try to understand the kind of trees that are here amongst us, we go back to about 1800. And the reason why we say that is because what we would call the old new growth forest, it's not really the old growth forest, it's one removed and kind of the secondary old growth. Old growth is determined from 150-year-old trees and beyond. And the trees here, the conifers and deciduous trees here, represent from about 175 to 200 years old. This particular tree here behind me doesn't look big. There's a photo in the beginning of this video showing this tree. This is a eastern white pine and is about 200 years old. Amongst some of those other trees in the beginning of the video, the first one was a hemlock, which is about 200 years old, and a yellow birch, which is also about 200 years old, and which appears to be off of a nurse log, possibly a hemlock, because it is in a little bit of a ravine where that hemlock grove is. And about 200 years ago, it appears that in the 1800s, or the early 1800s, they took the hemlock in that particular area and debarked them to use their bark for tanning leather, and left the standing logs, and when they fell, they create nurse logs, which the yellow birch particularly like because they are thirsty for water and prefer to be on nurse logs so they don't have to dig their roots into the ground right away and aren't strong enough. So from 1800 to about was the last time that this forest was probably fully logged, because the trees again here are about 50% of them are 200 years old. The most current logging of this property was back in 1950s, and we know that because in 1950 there was a hurricane that came up from the east and came across the Adirondacks from west to east, and these winds were so strong, knocked down about 1 million acres of forest in its path. In this particular property, all the trees that were leaning here were all leaning in a easterly direction, the same path of that hurricane. The rot on the logs and the stumps that were left behind were about 70-year-old rot. And we know this just by looking at them and the particular rot that white pines have at that period of time. The logs were then cut, the stumps left behind, and while they were here, took other white pines for building materials, the best ones. The ones that are still standing here that are 200 years old, and sometimes we wonder why that is. Why didn't they take those as well? Well, thanks to the white pine weevil, the trees were probably not a good enough quality, and branched off in several different directions as they were growing. The white pine weevil, when the trees are young, they breed in the leading shoot at the top of the tree, the most tender part of the tree. They dig in and lay their eggs. And by so doing that, they kill off that leading branch. The remaining branches, the strongest one next to that branch, would take over and sprout up, but also creating 2 and 3 shoots sometimes and rendering the logs in that tree really not valuable for lumber. Some of the photos I showed, one which had 2 and 3 legs to it going up, and standing dead, was rotten, but never had the opportunity to grow fast enough because of the canopy, and just died that way with 3 and 4 and 5 different shoots coming off of it. It was not strong enough to grow under the overgrowth. So after 1950, really there was no other logging that took place here, and the trees continued to grow. The hemlock forest behind me, they're all about 175 to 200 years old. In this particular area, there is a stand down below, but with the deciduous trees that are also about 70 years old. A lot of ash, yellow birch, red maple, and some spruce that grow amongst these larger white pines and hemlock, and they are spread throughout. The property hasn't been touched in a very long time, and we're going to continue to leave it that way. So we'll be back with some more information about this property. It's pretty interesting to understand what the history is in it. And the forest will tell you the history of what happened here several hundred years ago, if you know what to look at. Also, the duff on the ground. When you walk through a second old growth forest such as this, the ground is very spongy, and there's a lot of little mini hills and valleys where trees have toppled and their roots uplifted the dirt and left behind a little small hole behind it, which offers itself to trees like the yellow birch to grow off of those, kind of like a nurse log or that stump that was sticking up in the air after toppling over. So we know a lot about the forest now. We've done some research with Tom Wessel's 2 books. Reading the Forested Landscape, which is a fantastic book. In another book he has is Forensic Forests. A lot of good information there about understanding as you walk through a forest and looking at the trees, and if some are leaning in one direction or if they're rotten, how long have they been down, if there was any cut lumber, how many years ago was that, are there any abrasions on the logs from logging. The trees have been abrased and they have wounds on them that go ahead and heal. So it's quite interesting. Leaving the stags up here for birds and small animals and bugs to live off of is a great way to kind of keep the forest going and nurturing on its own. So there again, here at North of the Wind in the Southern Adirondacks in upstate New York. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.